All right. Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to deep breath in, deep breath out, talk about trauma, which is going to be a really interesting topic, but it's also going to be kind of a hard topic. So make sure y'all are checking in with yourselves. Take breaks if you need to. Ask questions. We would love to hear y'all's thoughts on this episode because it's going to be pretty informative. First off, we're going to just start off by defining trauma, which is easier said than done because trauma is kind of tricky to define. I was listening to Bessel Kolk talk about trauma before we started recording, and we'll talk about him later. But he even defined trauma back in like the 70s or 80s as being something that's experienced outside of the normal human experience. And he was talking about how ignorant that is of him to say, because trauma is a part of the human experience. Almost every single person experiences trauma in some degree throughout their life. And it's something that we face in our everyday world. And something that is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another person too. And so trauma is usually defined as something that is frightening, dangerous, or violent that poses a threat to your life or your bodily integrity. You can also witness traumatic events and that can cause trauma. Or you can have, basically it's experiencing anything that causes a strong physiological reaction and you feel deeply unsafe. And so that's why I think it's important to note that some people can experience trauma and not have a bodily reaction to it. And so that doesn't make it really traumatic for them, but the person experiencing the exact same thing, their body may react to it just based off of their own personal experiences or like their own personality. So does that definition just surprise y'all at all? Is that kind of lined up with what you were reading about?
Yeah, I feel like it goes along with what I've seen. And then also what I was noticing where they talked about with trauma, that it's kind of broken down where trauma could be, okay, it's a one-time traumatic event. It could be something that's long lasting for you. You know, you could just have initial response and then you go through it and you're fine. But for some people, it can create long-term effects for you.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's almost kind of how it's defined, because it's not just the stress of the actual event, it's also the lasting like physical and mental effects that it has on you, because those can go on for years. I mean, you can develop actual medical issues just having experienced trauma and how your body's kind of holding on to those. And so different types of trauma could be, like, no, Jazz kind of mentioned it, but complex trauma is usually whenever children experience abuse over years. But even just like witnessing domestic violence, experiencing racism, experiencing bullying, car accidents, war. There's a lot of other ones, sexual assaults, physical assaults. I mean, any type of abuse really can all be trauma.
Right. So there's like a difference between like capital T trauma and then just, regular trauma.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's big T trauma and little T trauma is what we call it. And so big T trauma is usually those ones that we think of as being really traumatic, like a horrible car accident or like a natural disaster or war or physical assault. But little T trauma can even be like, I've heard the example if you're reading in class in like your third grade class, and then everyone starts laughing at you and you feel like they're like laughing at you, and something like that, where it's like you're a younger person and you don't know how to experience this and it's humiliating. And as an adult, you can kind of see bigger than that picture, but as a child, it feels really traumatic. Mm-hmm. And so those are kind of something we would consider like little T traumas.
Like at the time, you don't have the methods to cope.
Right,
but when you look back, you're like, okay, this wasn't as huge as I thought it was at the time.
Right. But in your brain, then you're still experiencing it being like a humiliating thing, which that means your whole body is reacting to this humiliation.
But that's kind of interesting because that might not be considered capital T trauma, but because you don't know how to deal with it as a child, it definitely becomes like, it definitely affects you, right?
Yeah.
Like it affects your mentality, and maybe from there on, you just don't want to public speak, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start getting anxiety in a situation where you do have to like publicly speak, right?
Right,
So
absolutely.
that would be interesting, like to explore that, like how little t trauma can actually like become into like what did he call
Lasting
it?
effects.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is why they wanted to classify it as trauma, even though we may not be classifying it as like capital T trauma. We still want it to be classified as trauma because it does have those lasting effects of making you anxious about public speaking, or like just not feeling as confident whenever you have to like read something for work or whatever. You know what I mean? It just has those lasting effects that just makes you doubt yourself that little bit. And which means that is kind of classified as that trauma aspect of having those effects last over your lifetime.
And then
until
it
you
still
work on them.
acknowledges that what you went through was valid. What you're feeling about this situation is real.
Exactly. And I think that, yeah, I don't know what else to say actually. Pause.
So I know that we had said for this episode we would each kind of pick a disorder that was born out of trauma, but I didn't. I was trying to look one up, but then I got like overwhelmed and I didn't know which one to choose. So what I did end up doing was I found a couple of articles. And this one in particular is really interesting. And it's an opinion piece on New York Times. And it's called If Everything is Trauma is Anything, which is something that like kind of correlates with what Jazz said one time. Like if you highlight everything in the page, what actually matters. And it's interesting. It has a lot of to do with things that we've talked about in the past. So the article just kind of starts with this example of this guy who is like a player.
Are we meaning like he dates a lot of women player? Like
yeah,
playa?
yeah, that kind of player.
Okay. I didn't know if he was like a football player.
No. I was going to say another word that is not appropriate, but
I think I know the word starts with an F.
Yes.
Into the boy.
Yes. Anyways, it starts with that example of, okay, there's this dude who is playing a bunch of women, and then at the end of it, like the women like share their collective trauma with each other. And it's like, I don't know, like whatever he did of like getting them to like him and then ghosting them, like they consider that traumatic. And to a certain extent, I can see it. And to a certain extent, like I think using the word trauma is a little bit too much, but I don't know. I'm not going to be here and judge anything. And so I think that that's the point that the author was trying to make, right? And then it kind of goes into explaining like that situation of that guy doing that to all those women, and it's called like love bombing, which is like, I don't know if you guys have heard about that term, but it started like in the 1970s. It's basically like a person coming in hot into like the relationship, and like yeah, and then it's like they just like always want to be with you, like they say I love you, you know, in a couple of days, 2 weeks, as opposed to like months and stuff like that, and then they just like leave you, like ghost you. Right. And then it was explaining that, and then it started going into like trauma, like in politics, about how, you know, like with the Trump era, we started, instead of just calling him a liar, that we started using gaslighting, and like that has become a very like political term. And so now, but people now abuse that word to describe anything. Like if anything, like they feel like as their reality is being shifted, they just automatically call it gaslighting when it might not actually be that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's like thrown around so much that it kind of loses its meaning, or it doesn't, like the meaning doesn't, it's not as powerful anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I was just talking about this the other day because I watched a Grey's Anatomy episode, a like recent one. It's one of the ones from the recent season, but basically these two characters ended up breaking up, and the woman like tells him like, you were just gaslighting me. And I kind of had to sit back and think like, I don't actually know if that was gaslighting. And then it's that experience of like, am I allowed to say that that wasn't gaslighting? Because it wasn't happening to me. But at the same time, I don't think that met the definition of gaslighting. I think he just wasn't being like, oh, okay, we'll break up. I don't know. It was like he was having a conversation about it. I don't know. I felt very conflicted because it was just, I didn't like that word being used and taking that power away from it. But then it's also, am I allowed to be the one that's like, that wasn't gaslighting, your experience with that was not gaslighting. It could be something else, maybe. I don't know.
I know. That's how I feel right now when I just was like, you getting played is not trauma. But I'm like, well, I also don't know, right? Like you don't know unless you're standing like in that position.
Right. Well, and I think that's why I really like thinking about whenever we look at even the definition of trauma, like talking about your like physical reactions to it. Because if it's trauma, that means that your entire body is reacting and holding on to that. You're going into like a fight or flight response, basically, or a freeze. And so I think like your brain is shutting off ultimately with trauma. And so daily stressors, I mean, we have daily stressors all the time. And there are things that are hard and there are things that are difficult and stressful and hurtful, but that doesn't qualify them as trauma. And I mean, maybe that would be, we could tell this, the people who were ghosted be like, maybe that was a little T trauma. Would not sure I would use the capital T trauma on that. But again, I'm not sure that's my call. I don't know wasn't in your body to experience what that felt like for you too.
Yeah. Well, and it could have also evolved like the kid reading and everyone laughing at him. Like it evolved into his like fear of maybe being even in public, let's say. So I can see how having this like terrible romantic experience of like getting ghosted because you put all your eggs in that basket, like, you know, having like very traumatic aftermath. Like in other relationships, like you absolutely have no trust because you think, oh, they'll just leave me or like ghost me the way this other person did. So I can understand it in that aspect. But I thought it was interesting how the person who wrote this piece is like started the article with it and saying how trauma is just like thrown around for anything. And where I guess their point is like, yeah, they're taking away like the weight that capital T trauma is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like there was something you said that like had like conjured up something in my mind, but it was like what you were saying, how something small can like turn into something like long term. And it reminds me of that phrase that I'm going to butcher because I don't know the exact phrase, but it was kind of like how every avalanche starts with one snowflake, like this huge thing all started with something very small, but it just builds and builds and builds.
Right. And that even kind of ties into what I was thinking too about the woman who were ghosted. I feel like I mean, maybe that experience was what they identified as being traumatic, but it's also, I mean, this is probably really the therapist in me. But if I were to like look back in that person's life and talk to them about other people in their life, like, have you ever been left by people before? And like, so maybe now that this person's ghosting you, that's actually touching on something deeper than that relationship, but you're tying it to the feelings of that relationship. Does that make sense? Like the feelings that are coming up in you think are from the relationship, but actually maybe it's touching on something that was already there. That was a trauma.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's, yeah, just, you never really know what was the actual thing maybe that started it too. Maybe it was a snowflake. And not in the political term that is now being used for snowflake.
Which is another word that like you can't use without it being associated in a different way.
How dare they ruin snowflakes? The beautiful little unique pieces of snow and ice.
By using words for their meanings important.
Right. Language is very important. That is interesting though. I also think I was having this thought the other day too about, you know, I think it's great that our culture is talking more about mental health. And I think how comfortable we are talking about trauma is a part of that. But then there is also the other side of it, that's not everything is trauma. We still need to understand what the difference is. And just because you can identify something as trauma, that doesn't mean that you're like, oh, well, it's my trauma and this is the way it is now. And this is how I'm going to live my life. Because it's kind of, okay, what's that next step? You've identified it. Now we're going to work on it because this is your responsibility now. And I know I've said this before, but I just, those cards that can, not pulling a card because I don't really like that phrase, but basically saying this is an excuse almost of, okay, well, this is my trauma. And it's like, okay, maybe that was your trauma. Let's go ahead and treat that like a trauma then, which is working on it, working through it, processing it.
Putting in that work. And yeah, and definitely. And some of the things I saw where it's talking about trauma and those responses, you were saying how, you know, those initial reactions, it was saying could be, you know, confusion, anxiety, numbness, dissociation. But then they're saying delayed responses can turn into fatigue, disorders. And so, yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, if you don't work on something, you're going to be doing yourself more harm by not, okay, you've addressed the problem, but like you said, what is that next step? How are we going to work on it now?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think it's understanding that something horrible happened to you. Now it's kind of, you're holding this thing that's someone gave to you that you didn't want. So we have to figure out what you're going to be doing with this, you know, this cut on your hand, this thing that you're holding, because now this is your responsibility, which is hard and it's not fair, but it is. There was something else. Oh, and I think on that list of things that happen later on, shame is a huge aspect of trauma. Once you've experienced trauma, that comes on later down the road, is having those beliefs in yourself of like that unworthiness or feeling like it was your fault or other, you know, that you're bad or you're dirty or whatever it is. But just those thoughts of shame is a huge part of trauma.
I'm curious about what disorders you both picked.
Jazz?
So teach me.
I'll go. So the one I looked up was, and then I want to find the right term for it, was so dissociative identity disorder, which people used to call multiple personalities. So that may be a term that maybe more people are familiar with. But according to the DSM-5, look at me
Get it,
sounding
girl.
like Carly.
Get it, girl.
It says dissociative disorders are characterized by a disruption of and or discontinuity, sorry, I can't say the word, in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. And so with this, I feel like, so I'll bring up a media example that was kind of negative. But in general, when you talk about people with this, which also people call DID, usually what happens is this is a response to a trauma. Mostly it's been seen as something that happened in childhood. And it's important to note that they did say up to 75% of people experience at least one depersonalization or derealization episode. But as far as meeting this criteria of these chronic episodes in this disorder, it's usually about 2% of people. Women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with a dissociative disorder. And usually kind of the terms you hear about this is there's the main person, and they're usually called the host, and they may have these other identities, usually called the alters. These alters could be different gender than they are, different ages, have different personalities. And it's really a way in which their body is kind of coping with this trauma. And kind of just depending, the person may have amnesia towards these identities. A lot of times there is a connection between them. So they know that this person exist within them and they have a relationship. And sometimes they may not have control over when this alter chooses to show themselves.
Oh, dissociation is so fascinating. And I think you kind of said this too, Jess, but all of us dissociate to a degree. I give the example of if we're driving home from work and we kind of zone out and all of a sudden we're at home and we have that realization of, I don't even remember stopping at any of those red lights or stop signs. But I mean, I did, right? I mean, I got here safely, but I don't remember this drive really. That's us kind of a dissociative moment. That's us zoning out, us popping out of our mind for a little bit. And that usually happens whenever we're overwhelmed and we want to take a break. And that's our brain kind of going offline and taking a break. And so that all of us do that to a certain degree, but for it to become dissociative identity disorder, it is happening more often than not and kind of meeting certain criteria. A lot of people describe a dissociative moment during trauma of like being above their bodies and seeing what's happening to themselves, seeing what's happening to their bodies, but being above it. And I don't know if y'all have heard that experience before, but that's dissociation. And so usually it starts whenever you've experienced a trauma that's so overwhelming and your brain has no idea how to process it. And so it kind of just shuts off. And it's really interesting actually, because if you look at the brain scans of people who are dissociating, there is no activity whenever they're being triggered. None.
Wow. That's wild.
I'm like, that kind of gave me chills.
I know.
Yeah. You're really off. I mean, I think you're breathing still, obviously. But that doesn't take a whole lot of like neural networks firing. So usually if you experience a trauma and you might have PTSD or you may not have PTSD, because not all trauma leads to PTSD, but if you've experienced a trauma and you get triggered, if we were to look at your brain and you were being triggered, it would be the emotional parts of your brain are lighting up, like your fight or flight is lighting up, your emotional like parts of your brain that we've talked about before are lighting up. But basically all of your executive, like all of your thinking, all of your words, none of that is lighting up. And it's actually, you can see on different types of brain scans that there's less activity in like the language center of your brain, which is why it's really hard for people to even talk about trauma sometimes, because you can't even access language if you're being triggered.
Wow.
But so that's if you were like in flight or flight and you're just having flashbacks or something, that's what your brain would look like. But if you're dissociative, you just don't see any activity.
Anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's wild to me to even think about. And that's not something that would have even crossed my mind to be like, what are the studies about this? Because it's like, how do you go to that? Let's look deeper if that side of your brain's it's not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I saw. They were saying that as far as people who have this, they could have as few as 2 alters, but you can have up to 100 alters.
Mm.
And so to be living with this, and that's what they were saying as far as kind of what some treatments can be. And of course, now I can't find my notes.
Perfect.
Like, of course. Well, who knows? I'll get back to that.
You're good. Just take your time. Can Nicole cut this part out?
Yeah. I'll probably cut this out too.
Yeah, I'm like, it's extra long because I'm like, I can't find it.
I was gonna say that I feel like it's portrayed in the media as something like really scary. Like, for example, Split.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was gonna bring up.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then I might be making this up totally, but I think I like heard a story or like saw something, like I don't know if it was on YouTube or something, but it was about this girl, and she was a little girl and she had that disorder too, and I don't know how many personalities she had, but in one of them she like would hurt her little brother, and then in another one like it had something to do with a cat. Like I don't know if like she thought it was a cat, she was a cat or something, I don't know, but it was like really wild. And it was crazy to think that she was only like 9 maybe or 8.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, I'm like, was this real? I need to look it up now.
We talked in college, we talked a lot about a girl who had multiple personality disorder and who had a lot of alters. So I know who you're talking about. And for some reason I want to say Sybil, but I don't think that that's her name. I think that was someone else famous.
I feel like I heard about that. I feel like there's like a documentary with that name.
But I also have kind of heard controversy about like whether or not oh, why was I? Yeah, no, that's not her. I was gonna say the actress Sybil. That's not her.
Is her name Laura?
Oh, it was Sybil. It was just spelled differently.
Oh,
Oh my
okay. I
God,
did find my notes.
Okay, go for it, Jazz. This is where I
Action.
cut back.
So some of the treatments to deal with dissociative identity disorder could be a type of psychotherapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy, eye movement desensitization. You know the word.
Desensitization and reprocessing. It's a mouthful.
And medications to help. And also, just therapies as far as them knowing what are their triggers and just moving through this. And then, kind of going back to a little bit before about media. I don't know if people remember the movie that came out in 2016 called Split. I know for me, that was the first time that I had heard of dissociative identity disorder was when this movie came out, and there was a huge controversy about this is what that movie, even though they never say it in the movie, but that was a controversy of like, this is kind of what they're portraying. And it's you're putting out this portrayal that people who have this disorder are monsters. They do awful things.
Right. Well, and and I think that this is whenever, with that case having to do with Sybil, and she was the little girl who had multiple personalities. The thing about it is that it's easier to diagnose if someone is dissociating. It's really hard to diagnose personalities and different personalities. And so that one's a harder thing to prove, I guess, as far as I know. But yeah, so Split is, he has like supernatural powers too, and like one of his alters, and that's no. I wouldn't be surprised if you were able to do different things in one of your alters. Like if one of your alters is really good at sports and another one is very athletic, and then the other one is maybe not as athletic, that wouldn't surprise me, but you're still within your own, like a human capability, basically. But with treating dissociation, basically before you can even take that step into processing trauma, is you have to bring their mind back on network, right? You have to have them be able to be okay in their brain and feel safe in their brain. And so you're going to use a lot of grounding, you're going to use a lot of mindfulness, just even connect them back to their bodies, because if we're not connected to our bodies, we can't really process our trauma, because that's where the trauma is stored, is in our bodies. And so we have to kind of be aware of our bodies and our emotions and our thoughts to process the trauma. And so usually you have to even make it safe for them to come back into their bodies and make them feel safe to come back into their bodies and into their mind. There's this one theory that we learned that's actually one of my favorites, but it's kind of helpful for treating dissociative identity disorder, but it's called internal family systems. And the idea is that every single person is made up of different parts. All of us. And as we experience any type of trauma, our parts become more and more polarized. And so usually if it's not to the degree of dissociative identity disorder, it's just that some days I'm kind of acting more like this because this part is taking over. Like maybe I'm more defensive, maybe I'm more angry, maybe I'm more cynical, and like that's kind of a different part. But the idea is that whenever you've experienced so much trauma, your parts become so polarized that that's whenever you have dissociative identity disorder, and you can be in different parts without even recognizing other parts and their actions. Like you're really separate from them. And so in this theory, you have to kind of learn what every person's different parts are, and then ask the permission of like the manager parts, which are the ones that are usually in charge, to like work with and access the other parts of that person. It's kind of trippy, but it's really cool. It's one of my favorites. And I'll have resources on kind of that theory if anyone wants to read more about it in the link, but it is interesting. As I read through that book, I for sure identified my parts. And I was like, oh yeah, that's that one for sure. So do we want to talk about, well, go ahead, Jazz.
Oh, I was going to say one thing that I found that was interesting that I looked up was about taking into account culturally where you are and like what your culture believes. Because one thing I saw was saying that, so for dissociative identity disorder, and they're saying really you have to think about culturally where you're at. And they said for a lot of non-Western cultures, it said a sense of alternate beings within oneself may be interpreted as being inhabited by spirits or ancestors. Some places it's kind of more praised versus kind of like here in America, we kind of look at disorders as like, ugh.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah, that was something that really, I was like, hello?
Crap. I bet we lost her.
Hold on, y'all. Technical difficulties.
We're going to cut this. I mean, it's still recording, so I guess we can just wait until she pops back in. I think that her internet was kind of bad though. Did you notice that like there was a couple times of her like,
oh, like glitched?
Yeah.
I'm like, let me see, there's a message. She might have said something.
Oh yeah. Oh, she did. Did I freeze?
I'm like, you're gone.
Are you gonna text her?
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder if she knows she's gone.
And I was like, you're gone. I'm like, can you still see us?
Right.
Oh,
there you are.
Nicole.
Oh, I don't think is her.
Oh, you're
audio
muted.
on?
I was like, what the heck happened? Like you both froze and I was like,
I know. Well, we were just talking and then you just disappeared and we were like,
Well,
it like logged me off. It was so.
That's so weird. Oh, is your internet okay? Can you like hear us
I
now?
looked at my internet and it's perfectly fine. Like that was super weird.
Okay.
So what were you guys saying?
I don't remember. Jazz was saying something.
I recall I was talking
Cultural differences. And I was, because then we started talking about like, so in the other cultures, it's more praised.
Oh,
which then I was thinking about, so does that mean that in other cultures, you still experience something that's traumatic to have ancestors as like a part of you, like other beings in you, or you know what I mean?
yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Wait,
I don't know.
Like because so in other cultures, if your dissociation is, and I guess that's the other important difference, is it, are they dissociating or are they recognizing other beings within them? Because I think there's a difference.
Like how are they interpreting it?
Yeah.
Is what's and that also brings up a good point is what could be happening. So the same thing could be happening to this person. Let's say we're talking about person A, but in culture one, they view it as, okay, this is this disorder. This is what you're going through. And then in culture two, for them, that's not it. It's a spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. That is interesting.
More to learn.
Right. And I mean, I think it's just, that's why I feel like this diagnosing is so two-sided, because it is helpful sometimes to have a label so you can know kind of which framework might work well, which lens to like work with this client might work well. So you can have an explanation sometimes for like different things that are happening in your mind. But at the same time, you know, there could be a lot of different explanations for those things. Like trauma is usually the source of a lot of these diagnoses, a lot of these disorders. And so if you're processing the trauma, then those symptoms kind of go away. So then the label goes away. I don't know. Or you could be viewing it as totally not even a disorder and it is more of a spiritual thing. And it's, you know, I don't know. I think it's kind of good to just recognize however they view it too, because it's, I don't view it as something so important that I'd be like, no, really, you need to understand you have DID. It's like, you can view it as however you want. This is what we're working on.
What did you end up looking up, Carly? All the things?
Yeah. Well,
No,
I mean, I was
really.
more just thinking about kind of the differences between PTSD and borderline. Not differences, I guess I wouldn't say. But so I said this earlier, but even if you've experienced trauma, that does not necessarily mean that you have the diagnosis of PTSD. PTSD is usually if you're having flashbacks, if it's affecting you, you know, a year or so after the trauma. You're avoidant of like certain triggers, you're avoidant of certain situations, you have negative beliefs about yourself. So that would be, you can experience trauma and not have all of the criteria to meet PTSD. But for borderline, it's interesting because I think we hear borderline and we hear a lot of these diagnoses and don't think about the trauma that they're stemming from. Like usually people who have experienced borderline have experienced significant childhood trauma. And that is just, you know, if I have been left or have a major loss of a person in my life at a young age, that might create a lens that I kind of view relationships through that's different or unhealthy or dysfunctional, right? Like I may become overly attached to people. I may do things that keep those attachments stronger, or I may like pour into those relationships more because I'm afraid of losing them. And so that would still be stemming from those traumas. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I guess what I'm just curious why it is called borderline personality disorder. I guess like for me, it doesn't make sense.
No, I honestly don't know. That's a good question. Because I don't know what you're bordering on the line of.
Exactly. Like, because, okay, you gave the example if something happens during your childhood and you are responding to it, like your personality changes, like fluctuates throughout your life, right? Like
Right.
who's to say that your personality, the way that it is, or like how you address or respond to things isn't what it's supposed to be anyway. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Right. That does make sense. I was trying to look up.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. Cause yeah, through life, like everything that occurs to you or that you go through creates changes within you and your personality does change over time. I mean, there's always like a core view that's the same, but you do have those like growths within you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so are you kind of feeling like, well, and that's, I guess in all diagnosing, especially with personality disorders, they stem from very natural human and emotions and experiences, but they're just to such an extreme degree. And so, I mean, like with borderline, one of the most qualifying parts of borderline is this fear of abandonment. And which is a normal human experience, right? I mean, most of us don't want to lose a significant other, but that fear doesn't always play a huge, major impact on our lives. You know, like that might not affect my daily functioning, even though that might be something that I don't want at the same time. And so, I mean, narcissism, all of us have narcissistic traits. all of us are self-serving to some degree and have a hard time picking out what we've done wrong in situations, but that doesn't make us a narcissist. And so it's kind of all of these different traits stem from different ways that our brain copes, but have just gone to like a new level of diagnosis. And so, yes, all of us do have fluctuating personalities, moods, all of it. It's just at a certain level is whenever it qualifies for a diagnosis, whenever it's really impacting your daily life and all of your relationships.
I see what you're saying.
And I think that's why it's so good to talk about, because I don't know, I think that there is still stigma against like personality disorders, especially. And I don't know, they all come from usually a place of trauma and are usually very treatable. It's just that's kind of the cross that they have to bear. That's what makes their life a little bit more difficult, a lot more difficult sometimes.
I think it's so unfortunate that there's like such a bad, like stigma towards personality disorders. And honestly, I think it's probably like a multiple reasons. Like example one that Jazz gave, just like the portrayal of it in like media and like film. Like I think people just don't understand mental illness or mental disorders. And so because there is like a misunderstanding of it, it's scary, or it's like considered scary. Right?
Yeah. Right. I think it's portrayed as something that's kind of terrifying, when in the reality is I mean, all of us have met someone with a personality disorder and we just may not even know it.
Yeah. Yeah, like it's more normal than you think it is.
Right. And I think, did y'all see that movie Girl Interrupted?
I love that movie.
I'm pretty sure she has borderline. I'm pretty sure that's her diagnosis. The main girl, Winona Ryder.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't it borderline?
I honestly don't.
All I can remember is that it was there was a breakup at the beginning of the movie, and she either attempted suicide or was like talking about attempting suicide. But basically,
she attempted it, I think.
She did attempt. So basically it was the loss of this relationship that led her to having a kind of more severe reaction. And those are a couple of different qualifiers for borderline.
I say I love this movie, and then I don't even remember like.
Oh, I haven't seen it in years, right? Angelina Jolie's in it, and I don't remember her diagnosis.
Who's?
Angelina Jolie's.
Oh, I know. Well, I feel like hers is more intense. I feel like that's why she made more of an impact on me. But I'm like pulling it up. I don't remember.
I feel like that's how like movies are, where you'll say something and you're like, I don't remember it, but I remember how it made me feel. So I know it was good.
Yeah, right.
I remember that's really good.
Yeah. I was just thinking of like portrayals in movies and stuff of borderline. And that was the only one I could think of was Girl Interrupted.
Yeah, she does have that.
And yeah, I can't remember. I know Silver Linings Playbook, I think, was bipolar disorder.
Which one? Jennifer Lawrence or
Jennifer Lawrence? I don't remember what Bradley Cooper's was. Did he have a diagnosis?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he did. That's also, but that's such a good movie. Like
it is a good movie.
They did a really good job with it.
Yeah. Have y'all watched that show Modern Love?
No, actually haven't heard of it.
It's based off of, I think it was a podcast maybe called Modern Love, and it's basically different love stories in New York. And Amazon made a series out of it. And so each episode centers around a different story and has different actors and stuff. And Anne Hathaway is in one of them, and she has bipolar disorder. And it's actually, I felt like it was a good representation of kind of what that can look like. But it was, I thought that one was pretty well done. And I think, I don't know, sometimes they can be well done and then other times they can be split. And you think it's a monster.
And you take things to the extreme because you're trying to sell a story.
Right, exactly. Because it's actually a superhero movie, or not. Is superhero the right word? I mean, I know that like not Dr. Glass, Mr. Glass.
See, that's the thing. And then I remember that was another thing people were saying, like, well, this is based off of something else and it's going to be like a series and it's not what it seems.
Right. Yeah, I don't remember. I think ultimately the takeaway from all of this is that trauma is very treatable, and it should be looked at, and it should be considered, and it should be processed, because it really does affect your brain and your body, and you're holding on to all of those experiences. So it's really worth it to kind of work through some of those things and kind of release yourself from having to hold on to all of them. EMDR, what Jazz mentioned earlier, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is one of the most effective ways to treat trauma. That's a good one. I really like using that one. But I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, grounding, yoga is great for trauma. There's a bunch of things out there. Any other thoughts on trauma, ladies?
Yeah, I actually did come across something else, and I remembered it because we were talking about social media literally before we started recording. And I was curious because at some point I read something about trauma caused by watching news, or like like social, like happening in social media or whatever. And so I mean, I think it's just interesting because this particular like New York Times piece, it's called "The Trauma of Violent News on the Internet." And it starts off basically with like a quote by Obama. And he says, like, the world has always been messy, but now there's like social media. So it's like right there available at your fingertips. And the difference between news outlets and the social media is that news outlets, they just can't put anything right out there, but in social media there's almost like no filter. And as hard as like some companies work to filter out content, like it somehow like still seeps through, so you are able to see like very traumatic videos like real time. And a good example of that right now is like the war in Ukraine, right? Like, and so I was interested in that because, like, first of all, the war in Ukraine, right? Just seeing certain things, like, for example, what like really hits me hard is seeing like pregnant women or women who've just had kids, or like the conditions in which they're having kids. Or I even read a piece about how women in Ukraine are having like miscarriages or like premature births because they're under so much stress. And how like that's very detrimental, right? Like in a lot of cases, like the baby won't survive and neither will they. So just like this influx of like information is really like detrimental to you. And so I was reading about that, about how just being so aware in social media like can actually cause you to have post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that's one example. And also just the pandemic, right? And we've talked about this before, just like seeing the numbers, always like the graphs and everything on red, in that it doesn't seem like things are getting better. So that's also kind of what this article was talking about, how the pandemic is making us live through a collective trauma.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
nonstop information, just constantly, like I said, with it right at your fingertips. As soon as you open your screen, you don't even know what you're going to see. Like, you don't even have a chance to be like, well, maybe I don't want to see that.
Yeah, exactly. And there are, I don't know, I haven't really seen it on my feed, but I know there's been a couple times where I've come across like a warning. It says like, oh, this has like explicit or graphic content. But still, like, I've hardly seen that. Like, I don't really, like, you don't really get that much of a warning. And then also something that this article was talking about is that in this particular like app, I'm not sure what it's called. I don't know if it's like a European app specifically. It's called Periscope. Have you heard
Haven't
about
heard of
it?
it. Mm-mm.
No,
I'm
you
not
haven't?
hip.
Okay. Well, this article like brings it up because like just because current events, right? But then there's also like this thing happening on social, for example, especially with this one, that they're posting things like, for example, I mean, this is really sad, but there was a woman, like a young woman in Paris who basically live recorded her own suicide.
Mm.
And like people were watching it like in real time. And although like it was taken down from the app, it still made its way like in YouTube or other platforms.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just, it's so crazy to think about.
Right. Well, and I mean, so what you're kind of talking about is what's called secondary trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that therapists have talked about for kind of a long time, because whenever you're hearing someone's traumatic stories, your body feels all of that. And it's like you take all of that on and you don't have the barrier that you want to have. There's not a barrier that exists to have you not be taking this on and not be feeling that. And I think now with social media and all of these videos, it's every horrific thing you could possibly witness across the world at your fingertips. And seeing these videos, our mind doesn't process that this isn't, that this is a video. It's just thinking about like, this is something real, and you're feeling like you're watching it almost like you're in real life. Like if you were to see that happening, it's still witnessing something.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's absolutely traumatic to be able to see all of those things. I usually, if there's a warning sign, sometimes I don't look at them, just because I think that I understand, like with the war in Ukraine, I understand photographs being taken and videos being taken to show what's happening there and how important it is, and to empathize and do something and, take action against Russia, but against Putin, I should say. But I think it's also, I know myself, and I know that I will feel just as empathetic if I don't see those things. And so I kind of am like, that to me is not going to do anything good. That to me is going to paralyze me from doing anything, because I'm so overwhelmed with how sad this is.
Mm-hmm.
And that won't create me doing any change. Someone was talking about that the other day, that it's almost like you don't want to have empathy for people in these situations. You want to have compassion, because if you empathize too much, you put your body in like a flight or fight or freeze state. And I'm not helping if I'm in a trauma state myself, right? If I have compassion for someone, I can help, right? Without taking on what they're feeling. Because me taking on what they're feeling is not helping them lessen their load. They don't know that I'm taking on what they're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I need to delete Instagram. Ultimately is what this conversation's leading to.
Yeah. I just don't see the point.
I was even thinking, I had this thought a while back too, but whenever we were talking about doing this episode on trauma, and then the thing with Will Smith happened. Because so his book came out in this past year, and he talks a lot about witnessing domestic violence and witnessing his mother being hurt. And I mean, I've just been reading different things on it, but it's almost like you can totally understand how there was trauma attached to even what he did. But none of us know that. None of us see that. We just see what happened on stage. But knowing that history and knowing that part of it, I feel like is so important too, because that didn't happen in a vacuum. He saw that through his own lens, which was shaped by his own experiences, which was having witnessed domestic violence.
I didn't think about that, because it's true. Because even though, okay, we witness this thing on TV and we see on TV just start to end, it's still technically out of context of everything else. So true. It's like there's always something more going on.
Right.
I guess I just have a hard time. I mean, this could take a whole episode, but I have a hard time understanding that just because you went through something traumatic or you witnessed something traumatic through your life, it doesn't give you the grounds to do something, like to continue the violence.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so
Right.
I don't know anything. Like, to me, I mean, he's just like an actor. Like, I don't know anything about his life. And I'm not justifying like the joke either because it was in poor taste. But I also feel like you're at a certain place at a certain time. Like the reaction could have been different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And in no way am I justifying it. I think that there's an important distinction between understanding it and accepting it. I don't think it was acceptable in any degree. And honestly, even having witnessed it and people having witnessed it was triggering, right?
Mhm.
I mean, you're witnessing a violent act. And so that in itself is triggering. And so that is a whole other conversation. And I don't think, I'm not trying to take away from any of that. I think it's also just more understanding that that wasn't just him being angry and him being stupid. Like there was a basis for his decisions. And I think whenever we look at his context, the behavior makes more sense.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I'm like, I still need to know what happened though.
It does. I feel like it just helps to know. It helps to always know what happened, like things that have
Yeah.
happened, and kind of give
I
that
feel like it's, I think
context
it's
to it.
like what he did was wrong, but it came from something else besides that moment,
Mm.
but still wrong. And I'll be honest, I
Mhm.
honestly didn't even get the joke when I heard it. Like,
Oh, yeah. I didn't either. Well, and that's the thing though. Like he said the joke and it was like, okay, it's like it's not very funny. And then there's like context behind it, right? That she actually has
Alopecia.
oh yeah, alopecia.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so that's not funny. Like as a woman
Yeah.
losing your hair, it's horrible. Like that's a whole other conversation too of how it affects your views on yourself, like what society considers beautiful, like, you know, just all of these things. So it was in poor taste. Like,
Yeah. And I feel like it's the same thing of like, I watched the beginning to the end and I'm still missing the context of something. Like, it's still the same. Like, I saw the whole thing and I don't get it. And then it's that more, oh, well, because of this. And this is what happened with her and him and this, where it's like, and then I feel like more came out where it's like, okay, there is a lot more than what happened in that like 20 seconds.
mhm.
I'm also wondering too, and again, kind of just holding in mind this balance of this does not make this okay or acceptable. I'm also just wondering if we're going to see more things like this because, as Nicole was saying, we have been in a pandemic. We have gone through this collective trauma. There's a war happening and we're seeing images of that. I mean, we're taking on so much stress just daily. And I'm wondering if that, I mean, we were already kind of at capacity. Life was already hard. And now we're taking on all of these other stressors. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering if, I mean, that kind of just like, we can only cope with so much until we hit that tipping point. And so I'm wondering if we're going to see more things like that of just people not being able to cope with the situation because we're already at our max.
Where your emotional intelligence wears off.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I was already at my limit. So shout out to the emotional intelligence episode.
If you know, you know.
If you know, you know. You're on the in crowd.
All right.
Well, thanks for sticking around this season. This was a fun season. And I think we would love to hear y'all's thoughts on all of this, but I think we're going to be moving on to our next theme.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So stay tuned.
Have a good rest of y'all's day. Thanks for listening.